The church bells tolled 12 times deep and hollow, shaking dust from the rafters of St. Luke's. Candles trembled in the draught. Their flames wavered against stained glass that painted the congregation in blood-red light. Elliot Harper, 74, stood behind the pulpit. His hands, once steady from decades of carpentry, trembled as he opened his late wife's worn brown Bible. The microphone caught every creak of leather, every fragile breath. From the front row, Lydia adjusted her coat and whispered to her husband Nathan. Her words didn't reach the mic, but her eyes did, watchful, sharp. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera blinked red. The entire service was being streamed live, the town of Maple Hollow watching online as the old man prepared to speak. He turned a page. The faint sound echoed like thunder in the silence. Then something white slipped free and drifted down like a feather. Elliot froze. Slowly he bent and picked it up. It wasn't scripture. It was a contract. Across the top, bold black letters, "Agreement to sell 14 Maple Street," and below his own signature. A gasp rippled through the church. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Lydia rose from her seat, voice trembling perfectly. "Dad, you didn't tell us you already agreed to sell." Elliot's face turned pale. "I never signed that." The microphone hissed. The camera kept rolling. Reverend Paul took a step forward, uncertain. "Mr. Harper, that's your signature, isn't it?" Elliot stared at the paper as if it were alive. "I never." Silence swallowed the church, and somewhere in that quiet, a single voice whispered what everyone was thinking. Would you believe your own family could betray you in the name of God? Morning came gently over Maple Hollow, Vermont, a quiet town tucked between hills painted in shades of red and gold. The wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth. Inside the old wooden house at the end of Maple Street, a clock ticked steadily, each sound soft but sure, like the heartbeat of a place that refused to die. Elliot Harper woke before dawn, as he always did. 74 gray-haired shoulders stooped yet still broad. He moved carefully through the kitchen. He filled the old kettle, set it on the stove, and reached for the same chipped mug he'd used for 30 years. Outside, the trees swayed. Inside, the clock chimed 7, and the echo lingered through the halls that once echoed with his wife's laughter. The house had been a chapel, once a small-town church decommissioned after the war. Elliot had rebuilt it himself, board by board, when he was a young carpenter. The beams above his head were his work. The cross carved into the banister was Margaret's idea. Every plank carried memory. After breakfast, he sat at the table by the window, opened the brown leather Bible his wife had left behind, and read in silence. The paper had yellowed, the corners had curled, the smell of old pages mixed with coffee. His lips moved soundlessly. Better to be poor than a liar. From outside came the crunch of tires. A silver sedan stopped in front of the house. Elliot smiled faintly, his son Nathan and daughter-in-law Lydia. They came every Friday, though not always for reasons he liked. Nathan, 45, stepped out first. Tall, tired, his tie already loosened. Lydia followed, her tone cheerful but eyes sharp. "Morning, Dad," she called, balancing a box of pastries. "We brought those cinnamon rolls you like." He welcomed them in. The warmth of the house seemed to fight with the chill that came through the door. They ate together at the kitchen table. Lydia complimented the coffee. Nathan half listened, tapping at his phone. Elliot noticed. "Work again?" he asked. Nathan forced a smile. "Just some loan stuff, Dad. Nothing serious." But Lydia leaned in, her voice gentle, casual. "Actually, we wanted to talk about something. About the house." Elliot looked up slowly. "The house?" She nodded, glancing at Nathan for support. "You've got so much space, and it's getting harder for you to maintain. You could sell it, move somewhere easier. We could use the money to start fresh, a new cafe maybe. A real family business." Elliot's expression softened but didn't bend. "Your mother made me promise this home would never be sold." Lydia's smile froze for half a second, then she laughed lightly. "Promises don't pay bills, Dad." He looked her straight in the eye. "But they keep souls from being lost." The ticking clock filled the pause that followed. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, sipping his coffee. After they left that morning, Elliot walked the perimeter of the property. The white paint on this porch railing had started to peel. The garden Margaret planted, roses, lilies, lavender, had thinned with time. He touched one of the remaining rose stems. "Still here?" he murmured. That afternoon he went to the shed behind the house. A half-finished bench waited there, the kind he built for the church every Christmas. He sanded it slowly, each stroke whispering like a prayer. Later he opened the mail piled on the counter, Bill's advertisements, one envelope from the bank. He frowned at it unopened. Lydia, returning from the store, noticed. "Everything okay?" "Just papers," he said, sliding the envelope beneath the newspaper. She glanced at it long enough to see the return address, Vermont Heritage Bank. That night dinner was quiet. The clatter of silverware replaced conversation. Lydia served stew, smiling through the silence. Nathan scrolled his phone again. Elliot watched the two of them, the lines on his forehead deepening. The landline rang. Claire's voice burst through the speaker, bright and warm. "Hey, Dad, how's my favorite carpenter?" Elliot smiled, still hammering away. "You're working too much again." Maybe Claire laughed. "You eating right?" "Your sister-in-law keeps me fed," he replied, glancing at Lydia, who smiled back sweetly. Claire continued. "Boston's getting cold already. I'll visit soon. I miss that creaky floor of yours." "It misses you too," Elliot said softly. "Every step you took in this house still talks." They said goodnight. When the call ended, Elliot sat for a long time staring at the photo on the wall. Margaret holding baby Claire, Nathan barely 10. The color had faded, but the love hadn't. He rose, went to the living room, and turned on the small lamp beside his wife's chair. The Bible lay on the table, its edges glinting faintly in the low light. He ran his hand over the cover, whispering, "You still guide me, don't you?" Margaret Lydia entered quietly. "Need help cleaning up, Dad?" he smiled. "I've got it, thank you." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the Bible. "That's your wife's old one, right?" "Yes," he said. Her handwriting still in it, every margin filled with thoughts and prayers. Her voice softened. "Must be comforting." "It is," he said simply, and left her there. Hours later, long after he'd gone to bed, Lydia stood in the doorway of the study. The moonlight cut a path across the floor, landing on the Bible. She stepped inside, careful not to make the floor creak. On the desk lay a few papers, old tax forms, bank letters, yellowing photographs, and the brown leather book. She touched it gently, almost tenderly, then lifted the cover. Between the pages lay a small note in a woman's handwriting. Psalm 37, "Trust in the Lord." The signature below read, "Margaret Harper." Lydia's breath hitched. Her fingers traced the signature, lingering on the neat loops of the capital letters. Then, for the briefest second, her gaze sharpened. She closed the Bible quietly and set it back in place. From the hallway, the clock began to chime midnight. 12 slow, resonant strikes. Lydia stood motionless until the last echo faded. Then she whispered, "Better to be poor than a liar, huh?" and smiled faintly. In his room, Elliot stirred but didn't wake. The same verse slipped from his lips as if answering her from a dream. Better to be poor than a liar. Downstairs, Lydia looked once more toward the study, the shadows deepening around the Bible. She turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. And over it all, the sound of the clock continued steady and unbroken, counting down to something no one yet understood. The next morning, Elliot drove his old pickup into town. The church stood quiet at the corner of Birch Avenue, its bell tower rising above the trees. Reverend Paul met him at the door. "Brought another bench." Elliot, the pastor, smiled. "Just about finished," Elliot said, patting the back of the truck. "I'll drop it off Sunday. Margaret always said every church needs a place to rest." They stood a moment watching dust swirl in the sunlight. Paul's tone turned gentle. "You've kept your promise well, my friend. You've kept faith." Elliot looked down at his hands, calloused and tired. "Faith's easy when no one asks you to trade it." When he returned home, Lydia sat on the porch steps scrolling through her phone. She looked up with practiced warmth. "You're early. Everything okay?" "Fine," he said, heading inside. As he passed her, a folded flyer caught her eye, a real estate listing tucked in his jacket pocket from the bulletin board at the gas station. She smiled faintly, a spark of calculation behind it. That night, while Nathan slept beside her, Lydia stared at the ceiling. The ticking clock from the study echoed faintly through the floorboards. She whispered to herself, "Every promise has a loophole." 10 years earlier, the air inside St. Luke's Hospital smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant. Outside, storm clouds pressed low against the hills, and the sound of distant thunder rolled like a slow heartbeat. Margaret Harper lay in the small hospital bed, her breathing shallow but even. The light from the window touched her silver hair, the same shade as the wedding ring Elliot still wore. He sat beside her, his rough carpenter's hands wrapped around her frail fingers. He had sanded those hands smooth 1,000 times, yet they still trembled. Claire, their daughter, sat quietly near the window, eyes red from crying, her notebook forgotten on her lap. Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "You've worked your whole life building things, Elliot. Houses, benches, that porch swing I still love." He smiled faintly. "You always pick the color." Her lips curved. "I only asked that you build them strong enough to last." "I did," he said. "And you did too." She glanced toward the small nightstand beside her. On it lay a brown leather Bible worn at the corners, the spine repaired with tape years ago. Margaret reached for it, and Elliot helped her lift it. She turned it over slowly, tracing the faded gold letters of her name inside the cover. "Elliot," she said softly, "if you keep your faith, keep our home too. Promise me it'll never be sold." He froze, his throat tightening. "Don't talk like that." "I need to," she whispered. "That house is more than walls. It's where we prayed, where we forgave. It's where our children learned what love costs." Claire looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "Mom?" Margaret smiled at her daughter. "Someday you'll keep him strong for me." Elliot bowed his head. "I swear, Margaret, this house will stand as long as I breathe." She nodded, eyes closing for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked twice, then struck 6. The sound filled the room like a quiet promise. After a long silence, Margaret exhaled, her fingers tightening around his. "Then it's settled." She turned to Claire again. "Remember, sweetheart, faith isn't about buildings. It's about keeping what's sacred even when it hurts." Claire tried to answer, but her voice broke. Elliot leaned down, pressing his forehead to Margaret's hand. Outside, the storm gave way to a thin streak of sunlight through the window. It fell across the Bible, glinting on the gold-edged pages. 2 days later, the church bells tolled for Margaret. The whole town came, neighbors, friends, even strangers who'd sat on the benches Elliot had built for the church. The pastor read, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Elliot stood beside the coffin, the Bible clutched to his chest. He didn't cry, not then. When everyone had gone, he stayed behind as the wind stirred the maple leaves, whispering over the fresh soil. He sat on the damp grass, his suit coated in dust, and opened the Bible. A single pressed rose lay between the pages, Margaret's handwriting beside it. Psalm 37. "Trust in the Lord." Elliot whispered, "You gave me faith. I'll give it back by keeping your promise." The light dimmed. The bell tower rang 6 times, echoing across the hills. Each chime seemed to nail his vow deeper into his soul. Years later, whenever the clock in his study struck 6, Claire would remember that sound. She could still see her father kneeling in the rain, still hear her mother's fading voice saying, "Keep our home too." Back in the present, as Lydia's laughter drifted down the hallway and talk of selling the house grew louder, Claire could almost feel her mother's hand on her shoulder again. She trusted him with her faith, Claire whispered to herself, and faith was the one thing money could never buy. The old clock ticked on, steady, faithful, unchanged. Before leaving the graveyard, Elliot placed the Bible on the headstone for a moment. Rain had stopped. Only the dripping of water from the maple branches remained. He whispered, "You built the heart of this house, Margaret. I'll guard it." Then he picked it up, pressed it to his chest, and walked home beneath the sound of distant bells that refused to fade. Sunday arrived with the kind of chill that seeps into the bones, the kind that makes silence feel heavier. Maple Hollow's church sat at the edge of town, its bell tower piercing the gray sky. Inside, candles flickered and the smell of old wood and wax filled the air. Lydia moved quickly between the pews, giving orders in her calm, efficient tone. Flowers by the altar, not in front of it, and someone checked the camera feed we're streaming today. She smiled when people thanked her. Everything about her seemed graceful, generous, devoted. Only Nathan knew the tremor hiding behind her smile. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured, pulling her aside. Lydia adjusted his tie, keeping her voice low. "If we don't act now, the bank takes everything. He's too stubborn. You said it yourself." Nathan's jaw tightened. "He's my father, Lydia." She looked up, eyes sharp. "And you're a husband now. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for us." Elliot arrived a few minutes later, leaning on his cane. He wore his best suit, the same gray one from Margaret's funeral. In his hands was the Bible Lydia had handed him that morning, a perfect replica of his wife's down to the worn leather and faded edges. Only the stitching on the spine was new. but no one would notice. "Thank you, Lydia," he said softly. "You kept it in such good condition," she smiled. "I thought Margaret would want you to use it today." As the organ began its hymn, Elliot felt a lump form in his throat. He looked out over the small crowd, neighbors, church friends, his son, his daughter-in-law, all smiling back. He felt Margaret's presence in the flicker of the candles. The service began. The pastor spoke of love and memory. When it was Elliot's turn, he rose slowly, clutching the Bible. The camera light blinked red, broadcasting live to the town's Facebook page. His voice shook slightly. "Margaret once said faith isn't about never falling, it's about who helps you stand again." He opened the Bible. The paper rustled softly. Then a single white sheet slipped out and fluttered down. Gasps spread like a wave. Elliot frowned, bent to pick it up. Words glared up at him in bold black print: agreement to sell 14 Maple Street. For a moment, he didn't breathe. His eyes darted to the bottom, his own signature dated 3 weeks earlier. The silence broke. Lydia's voice trembled, perfectly rehearsed. "Dad, you didn't tell us you already agreed to sell." The pastor blinked. "Is that real?" Nathan stepped forward. "Dad, what is this? I don't know." Elliot stammered. "I never—" Lydia turned toward the crowd. He must have forgotten. "He's been confused lately." Murmurs filled the church. The pastor picked up the paper, squinting at the ink. "That's definitely your signature, Mr. Harper." Elliot's knees weakened. "It can't be. I'd remember." The camera zoomed in, hundreds of viewers watching live. Someone whispered, "Poor man, he's losing his mind." Elliot clutched the Bible to his chest. The clock above the altar chimed 12 times. Each toll echoed through the hall like judgment. That evening the house felt colder. Lydia reheated leftovers, humming softly as if nothing had happened. Elliot sat at the table, staring at his hands. "I just don't understand," he muttered. "Why would my name be there?" "Maybe you signed something months ago," Lydia said gently. "Remember the insurance forms?" Nathan added. "Dad, it's okay. We'll figure it out. You've got a lot on your mind lately." Elliot looked between them. "You think I'm losing it?" "No," Nathan said quickly, but didn't meet his eyes. Upstairs, Lydia smiled faintly at her reflection in the dark window. "It worked," she whispered. Hundreds of miles away in her Boston apartment, Claire Harper watched the live stream replay. The moment the paper fell, she paused the video, zoomed in, watched again. The page was too white, too smooth. The ink didn't bleed like a ballpoint, too crisp for a fountain pen. Her father's hand shook. His signature should have been uneven, but it was perfect, exact. She opened her old folder of family documents, the insurance policy her father once mailed her for safekeeping. His signature at the bottom matched perfectly. Her stomach turned. She grabbed her car keys. By dawn, Claire's sedan pulled into the driveway. The old house stood still in the mist like a secret waiting to be confessed. Elliot opened the door, surprise flashing in his tired eyes. "Claire." She hugged him tightly. "I saw the video." He nodded slowly. "It's true. My name was there. Can I see it?" she asked. Lydia appeared behind him, holding a mug. "Claire, we didn't expect you. I needed to check on Dad." Lydia handed Elliot the mug, her smile bright but cold. "He's fine, dear, just tired." Claire's eyes flicked to the papers on the table, among them the agreement to sell. She picked it up. "This ink looks brand new." Lydia shrugged. "The pastor verified it." Claire met her gaze. "Did he verify your morals too?" Nathan stepped between them. "Enough. We're not doing this." Elliot lowered his head. "Maybe I did sign it. Maybe I forgot." Claire turned to him, her tone soft but firm. "Dad, you remember Mom's Bible, right?" "Where is it?" "In the study," he said. "Why?" "Because that's where the truth used to live." That night, after everyone went to bed, Claire moved quietly through the hall. The moon cast a silver glow across the study door. She pushed it open. The clock ticked in the silence. The Bible sat on the desk. Its stitching gleamed nylon, too new. She opened it gently. The pages were almost empty. No notes in the margins, no pressed rows, no verse written by her mother. "This isn't hers," she whispered. The clock struck midnight. 12 slow chimes. She closed the Bible, her jaw set. The next evening, Lydia and Nathan returned from town to find Claire waiting in the living room. "Sit down," she said calmly. "What's this about?" Lydia asked. Claire held up her phone. I called the insurance office. Dad's signature was scanned for a policy renewal years ago. Same copy you used to fake the sale. Lydia froze, but Nathan spoke first. You're accusing my wife of forgery. I'm stating facts. Elliot appeared in the doorway. Claire, stop. Please. Lydia crossed her arms. You're upsetting him. I'm protecting him from what Lydia snapped. The truth. The fact he can't tell what's real anymore, Nathan muttered. Lydia. No, she should hear it, Lydia said. Your father's not the saint she paints him to be. He's old. He forgets. And maybe he signed because deep down he knows we need this. Elliot's face went pale. He turned and left the room without a word. Claire whispered after him, She's lying. I know, came his faint reply, but everyone believes her. That night, Lydia slid another paper toward Elliot as he sat by the lamp. Dad, we can fix this. Just sign again and it'll all be clean. We'll pay the debt, keep the family together. Elliot stared at the pen. His hand shook. He thought of Margaret's voice, faint as a breeze, keep our home too. He touched the pen to the paper. Then the clock struck 12. The sound boomed through the house. He dropped the pen. No, he whispered. I promised her. Lydia's face hardened. Then you'll lose everything. Maybe, he said softly, but not my soul. Outside, snow began to fall. Claire sat alone in the truck watching through the window as Lydia stormed out. She wiped tears with the back of her hand. Hold on, Dad, she murmured. I'll prove it. The next morning she drove to the church. The pastor greeted her warmly. Reverend Paul, she said carefully. The Bible my father used on Sunday. Who gave it to you, Lydia Harper? He replied. She said it was Margaret's original copy. Why? Claire exhaled sharply. Because the real one's missing. That night she returned home and found Elliot sitting at the kitchen table staring at the clock. It's midnight again, he said quietly. It never skips a beat. Claire placed her hand over his. Neither did you. He smiled faintly. Your mother used to say faith and time are the same. You only lose them when you stop paying attention. She nodded. Then maybe time will help us find the truth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Upstairs, Lydia packed her bag, muttering under her breath. Every promise has a loophole. Downstairs, Claire whispered to her father, We'll find Mom's Bible. He looked at her, tears glistening. Then maybe she'll find us again. 2 days later, Lydia parked outside Vermont Heritage Bank. The December wind bit through her coat. Inside Mr. Greeley, a man in his 50s with a polished smile, greeted her behind his desk. Mrs. Harper, he began, tapping a file. Your loan deferral expires Friday. Unless there's a full payment or new collateral foreclosure proceedings will resume. Lydia's lips tightened. I told you my father-in-law's house isn't yours. He interrupted gently. Yet. She forced a smile. He's agreed to sell. We're finalizing it. Greeley raised an eyebrow. Then bring me the signed documents by Thursday. Her voice wavered. Thursday, or the sheriff takes your cafe equipment on Friday morning. Lydia stood there frozen, her reflection staring back from the glass partition. The cafe had been her dream, one that burned down faster than the mortgage could handle. Nathan's guilt, the neighbor's pity, the creditor's calls, they all blurred together. When she finally spoke, her tone was steel. You'll have your documents. As she walked out into the cold, snowflakes began to fall. She wrapped her scarf tighter, whispering to herself, If the old man won't help us, I'll make him help. The wind swallowed her words. Somewhere behind her, the church bell rang noon. That night, Nathan sat in the garage, the door half open to the cold. Empty beer cans lined the workbench beside an old photo of him and Claire as children. His hands shook as he opened another can. Claire stepped inside quietly. You'll freeze out here. He didn't look up. Better than in there. She's pretending everything's fine. Claire leaned against the doorframe. You mean Lydia or Dad? Nathan gave a short, broken laugh. Both. He rubbed his eyes. You think I wanted this? The lies. The pressure. Every call from the bank feels like a noose tightening. Claire's voice softened. You could stop and do what he snapped. Watch everything collapse. You think you can fix it with piano lessons and pretty words. This isn't about faith, Claire. It's about surviving. She took a step closer. Surviving doesn't mean selling your father's soul. He looked at her, then really looked, the weight of years between them. You don't understand the bills, the debt. Dad's mind drifts. Half the time he forgets what day it is. Maybe she said quietly, but he remembers what matters. Nathan swallowed hard. His voice cracked. I didn't want to trick him. I just wanted to breathe again. Claire picked up the photo from the bench, brushed the dust away. Then start breathing the right way. He turned away, tears streaking down his face. It's too late. No, she said, setting the photo back. It's not too late until the truth's buried. As she left, the sound of the clock in the house reached them faintly through the walls, 12 steady beats that neither of them could ignore. Hours later, the house slept. Only the faint ticking of the grandfather clock kept time alive. Claire sat in the study, laptop open, replaying the church livestream again and again. At 14 minutes, she saw it, Lydia walking up to the pulpit before the service started, placing the Bible on the lectern, then glancing around. Claire zoomed in on the freeze frame. Lydia's ring caught the light, the same ring visible in the video when the forged paper fell. There you are, Claire, whispered. She printed the still image, tacked it to the wall beside other clues. Bank notices, old contracts, the insurance policy with her father's signature. Each paper overlapped like layers of deceit. The lamp flickered, the bulb hummed. Outside, wind moaned through the eaves. Claire leaned back, exhaustion creeping in. On the table sat a candle, half-burned, a relic from Margaret's funeral. She lit it again. The small flame trembled, throwing golden light over the photo of her parents' wedding tucked behind the papers. She whispered, Mom, if you're still watching, I'm not letting them take it. The clock struck 12. Each chime rolled through the house like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. The flame wavered but did not die. Claire whispered, the truth's been here all along, in plain sight. Outside the window, snow drifted under the streetlight, falling softly over the roof of 14 Maple Street, the house that refused to surrender. Morning crept over Maple Hollow, pale and uncertain. The storm had passed, but the world outside seemed drained of color. Inside the Harper house, everything was still, the kind of silence that made clocks louder, breaths heavier. Elliot sat by the window in his old armchair, the leather Bible resting open on his knees. His fingers traced the margins that should have held Margaret's handwriting, but the pages were blank, lifeless. It's all words now, he murmured. No voice. He turned another page, the sound brittle like dry leaves. The reflection of the winter light caught the glass of the framed wedding photo on the mantel. Margaret's smile, frozen in time. He spoke to it, not really expecting an answer. I thought I could keep the noise of the world out, but I let it in through my own children. Behind him, the floor creaked. Claire stepped in quietly, holding a folder. Her voice was careful, gentle. Dad, I need to show you something. Elliot didn't look up. If it's more proof, I don't need it. I already know it's true. She set the folder on his lap. Inside was the printed still image, the one of Lydia placing the Bible on the pulpit before the service. The timestamp glowed in the corner. He stared at it for a long moment. The color drained from his face, but he didn't flinch. She fooled me, he said softly. But I fooled myself first, for thinking family means faith. Claire knelt beside him. You didn't fail her, Dad. You kept your promise. They're the ones breaking it. Elliot's jaw tightened. A promise isn't paper, Claire. It's the weight you carry even when your hands are empty. She looked at him, tears blurring her vision. Then you're still holding it. For the first time in days, he smiled faintly. It was tired, but real. Your mother once told me the louder the world gets, the quieter faith has to be. Maybe it's time to listen. They sat together, the morning light growing warmer on their faces. Through the window, the snow melted from the branches, water dripping rhythmically into the soil. Elliot closed the Bible and placed it on the table. I can't undo what they did, he said, but I can choose what comes next. Claire squeezed his hand. We'll fix this. We'll find her Bible and everyone will know. He looked at her. His daughter, his last tether to what Margaret called the heart of the house. Finding it won't change them, he said, but it might change us. Outside, the distant bells of St. Luke's began to ring again, soft and measured. 12 chimes, each one fading slower than the last. Elliot leaned back, eyes closed, listening. The narrator's voice broke the silence, low and steady. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel anger. Only the weight of a promise and the sound of time keeping it alive. The clock ticked once more, then the scene faded to quiet. The night after the storm was still. The wind had softened, leaving only the sound of snow tapping gently against the windows. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of pine and candle wax. Elliot sat alone at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting a warm, uneven glow across the wood. He turned the pages of the Bible, the false one, slowly, as if gentleness might make it tell the truth. Page after page offered nothing but silence, no notes in the margins, no rows pressed flat by love, just emptiness pretending to be faith. He whispered, "You built this house with your hands, but she built its soul." The grandfather clock ticked 12 times, steady, echoing through the quiet rooms. The same rhythm that had once measured his days now counted his regrets. Elliot reached for his glasses, then stopped. Through the blur of tears, the ink on the pages shimmered like ghosts. He saw Margaret's handwriting where there was none, her notes curling in the corners of memory. Psalm 37. Trust in the Lord and do good. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. Even now you're still teaching me. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the siding, humming through the cracks like a low hymn. He closed the Bible and looked toward the living room. In the dim light, the house seemed alive again. The staircase, the walls, the old photos whispering in their frames. Claire entered quietly, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose from sleep. She stopped at the doorway, watching him. Couldn't sleep either. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "The clock's too loud tonight." She sat, tucking her legs under the blanket. "Mom used to say the house listens. Then it must be tired of silence," Elliot said with a sad smile. Claire studied her father's face, the deep lines, the exhaustion, the strange peace in his eyes. "I had a dream about her," she said softly. She was standing in the doorway holding a candle. She said, "Truth sleeps beneath dust." Elliot looked at her, the words sinking into him like seeds. "Truth beneath dust," he repeated. Maybe she meant something. Maybe Claire said, "Maybe we've been looking in the wrong place." He nodded slowly. Maybe God's keeping her promise safe somewhere. The old floor creaked as the house settled, as if agreeing. Claire rose and walked to the counter. She found the small brass candle holder that once belonged to her mother. Dust covered its rim. She wiped it clean, placed a candle inside, and set it on the table. Elliot struck a match. The flame flickered, caught, and grew steady. Its light spread across their faces, across the table, across the worn Bible. "Do you remember what verse she always read on cold nights?" Claire asked. Elliot nodded. His voice trembled as he recited, "Trust in the Lord and do good, so shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed." The candlelight swayed between them, warm and alive. She believed in that, Claire said. She lived it, Elliot replied, even when faith hurt. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I thought keeping her promise meant keeping the house standing, but maybe it meant keeping love unbroken." Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. For a moment they just sat there, the flame between them breathing softly, steady as a heartbeat. "Dad," she said, "I don't think Mom's gone. Not from here. I think she's been trying to tell us where to look." Elliot smiled weakly. "If she is, I hope she's patient. I've always been slow with clues." They both laughed, quiet, real. The sound filled the kitchen with something lighter than sorrow. Later, as the candle burned lower, Elliot walked to the window. The snow outside glowed under the porch light, smooth and untouched. He whispered, "We'll find you, Margaret. One more time." Claire stood beside him. "We will," she said. The clock chimed again, softer now, its echo spreading through the house like a memory breathing. Elliot turned to her. "You know," he said, "when I first built this place, I thought I was building a home for us, but I think it was the other way around. You and your mother built it for me." She smiled through tears. "Then let's keep it that way." He nodded, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. "Your mother used to say, faith's not about what we see, it's about what we remember when we can't." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then she's still here." They stood in silence, watching the snow fall. The candle flame wavered but refused to die. Its glow mirrored in the window beside their faces. In the quiet, a single sound rose, the faint turn of a page from the Bible on the table, though no one had touched it. Elliot looked back. "Did you hear that?" Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe the house isn't tired of silence after all." The narrator's voice faded and low and reverent. In a home built on promises, silence can speak louder than grief. And sometimes what's broken waits to be found in the light of faith. The candle burned until dawn, its flame never faltering. But Elliot didn't sleep. Near midnight he woke to the faint sound of humming, low, familiar, like the way Margaret used to sing when she cooked Sunday dinner. He rose from his chair, following the melody through the darkened hall. The house creaked, whispering under his feet. He stopped at the door of the study. The Bible lay open where he had left it, the candle burned down to a stub, and yet the page had turned Psalm 37, the verse Margaret loved most. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, lilac, and cedar. He knelt beside the table, his voice barely a breath. "If this is you, if you're still here, show me how to keep the promise right." His eyes closed, and for a moment he felt a warmth brush his shoulder, light as touch. Then the clock struck, once soft, patient, certain. In the morning, Claire found him asleep by the table, the candle long gone, but the room still carrying its scent. She covered him with a blanket, then noticed the open page, the verse circled faintly in pencil. She traced the mark with her fingertip and whispered, "Psalm 37. Through the window, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Dust motes floated in the beam, glittering like tiny embers. Claire looked up and murmured, "Truth sleeps beneath dust." She smiled faintly. "I think I know where to start." Morning sunlight spilled through the frosted windows, thin but bright, slicing through the gray that had hung over Maple Hollow for days. Claire stood by the table, her coat already on, eyes fixed on the open Bible. The penciled circle around Psalm 37 glimmered faintly in the light. She whispered, "Truth sleeps beneath dust." Elliot stirred from the chair, rubbing his eyes. "What did you say?" "I think I know where to look," she said. Within an hour, they were driving through the narrow, snow-lined streets toward St. Luke's Church. The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically, each swipe a reminder of time running out. Elliot gripped the worn handle of his cane, his jaw tight. "I haven't been here since your mother's service," he said. Claire nodded. "Then maybe that's where the truth's been waiting." The church stood quiet under a blanket of snow. The bell tower rose above the town like a guardian that never slept. Inside, the scent of wax and cedar filled the air. Reverend Paul appeared from the side aisle, his face lighting up when he saw them. "Elliot Harper," he said warmly, "and Claire. What brings you here so early?" Claire hesitated. "We're looking for something that belongs to my mother, a Bible. The real one." The Reverend's brow furrowed. "Real one?" Elliot stepped forward. "The book my wife carried every Sunday, the one I read from at her service. My daughter-in-law brought me another copy last week. It wasn't hers." Paul nodded slowly, his memory piecing itself together. "Now that you mention it, Lydia dropped off a Bible before the memorial, said it was Mrs. Harper's original. I didn't question it. Do you still have the old donations?" Claire asked. "In the back room," he said. "Come." They followed him through a narrow corridor to a small wooden door. Dust hung thick in the air as he switched on the light. The room was cluttered, boxes of hymnals, stacks of candle holders, crates of wood carvings Elliot himself had made decades ago. "This was her favorite place," Elliot whispered. "She used to clean here when no one else would." Claire brushed her fingers over the top of a crate, leaving streaks through the dust. Then, maybe she left something behind. Paul smiled faintly. "I'll give you some privacy." The door clicked shut, leaving them in a golden hush. Elliot's eyes roamed over the room. Every corner held pieces of his past benches he'd built, old pews he'd repaired. And then he saw it, a small wooden chest in the far corner marked with his initials, E.H., burned into the lid. He knelt slowly, brushing away years of dust. The hinges creaked as he lifted the lid. Inside lay Margaret's Bible. The real one. The leather was cracked and soft, the stitching loose, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to its pages. A pressed rose rested between them, its color faded but intact. Elliot's breath hitched. "Oh, Margaret." Claire crouched beside him, her hand trembling as she touched the cover. "It's really hers." He opened it carefully. Between two pages lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He unfolded it, his hands shaking. Margaret's handwriting swept across the page. "Keep your promise. The home belongs where love still listens." Elliot's throat closed. He pressed the note to his chest, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She knew, he whispered. She knew they'd come for it one day. Claire placed a hand on his back. She left Faith where they'd never look. In dust and silence, he finished, smiling through tears. The old clock in the hall struck 12. The sound echoed through the room, solemn but peaceful. Light from the stained glass window fell directly onto the Bible, scattering color across the walls, blue, gold, crimson. Elliot wiped his eyes. "Your mother was always smarter than me. She just trusted you to find your way," Claire said. He looked at her. "And I almost didn't." "But you did," she said softly, "and now we make it right." He nodded, standing with difficulty. "We will." They carried the Bible to the front of the church. Reverend Paul waited near the altar, surprise widening his eyes when he saw the book. "Where did you find it?" "In the dust," Elliot said simply. Paul smiled. "Seems like faith never really leaves, it just waits to be dusted off." Elliot opened the Bible again, glancing at Margaret's handwriting, then at the empty pews. "Reverend," he said, "I need to speak this Sunday. I need them to hear what truth sounds like." Paul hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course. I'll make sure everyone's here." Elliot closed the book, holding it tight against his heart. "Not everyone will want to listen, then speak for the ones who need to," Paul said. Outside, the wind had stilled. The sun broke through, glinting off the snow. As they stepped out of the church, Claire linked her arm with her father's. The bells began to ring, 12 slow chimes, deep and steady. Elliot looked up at the tower. She always said God's verdict doesn't come in anger, but in timing. Claire smiled. Then maybe this is his verdict. He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Then, let's make it count." As they walked toward the truck, the stained glass behind them caught the light. For a moment, the reflection shimmered over the snow like fire. Margaret's favorite color, golden red. The narrator's voice closed the scene, calm and reverent. In the end, the truth didn't rise from anger, but from faith. And faith, once found again, never stays silent. The bells faded, leaving only the sound of footsteps in snow. Sunday came bright and cold, the sky washed clean after a week of storms. By the time the bells began to ring, every pew in St. Luke's was filled. The whispers were everywhere, the old man, the Bible, the house. Even those who hadn't gone to church in years found a reason to come. Cameras were already rolling when Reverend Paul stepped to the pulpit. "Today," he said, "we hear not from Scripture, but from a man whose faith built this church's very walls. Mr. Elliot Harper." Applause rippled softly, hesitant, uncertain. Elliot rose from the front pew, the real Bible clutched against his chest. Claire walked beside him, her hand steady on his arm. Lydia and Nathan sat a few rows back, Lydia stiff, Nathan pale. Elliot reached the pulpit and laid the Bible down. For a moment he said nothing. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. "When I last stood here," he began, "I opened a lie." His voice cracked, but he didn't falter. "Today, I opened the truth." He turned the final page. A folded slip of paper fell floating slowly to the floor. Claire bent and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. Her voice shook as she read aloud. "This home is promised to Claire. Margaret Harper." Gasps swept through the crowd. Lydia's face drained of color. Nathan dropped his head into his hands. Elliot's eyes filled, but his smile was gentle. He sank to one knee, whispering to the heavens, "I kept it, Margaret. I kept it." Reverend Paul stepped forward, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe that's how God writes his verdict," he said quietly. For a moment there was only silence, then a single clap, hesitant, followed by another and another. The applause swelled, filling the sanctuary like rising wind. Claire helped her father to his feet. The morning light spilled through the stained glass, washing over them in gold and crimson. Lydia wept silently. Nathan reached for her hand, but she turned away. Elliot looked up toward the tower, tears shining. The clock began to strike 12. Each chime rang clear and slow, echoing through wood and stone. The narrator's voice faded, and low and steady voices fade. But guilt echoes louder. A house can be rebuilt. A promise can't. Tell us, do you believe some promises should never be broken? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories where truth finds its voice again. Thank you for watching.